Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. We're going to get started in just a few minutes, but we just want to give everyone a chance to get logged in and get comfortable. While we're waiting, please jump into the chat box and let us know where you're watching from today. We want to know, where is your college or university located? And we're also curious, approximately how much philanthropic revenue does your organization raise each year? So while everyone's getting settled in, just let us know where you're located. And we also want to know approximately how much philanthropic revenue does your organization raise each year? You can hop into the chat box to see that. And while we're waiting, we'll just read out some of those answers as they come in. So for anybody just joining, we just want to know where you are tuning in from. Just jump into the chat box. We're also curious to know approximately the philanthropic revenue your organization raises each year. We are at start time, but I see some answers coming in there. So tuning in from Michigan, hello. And I'll let you just keep popping your answers into the chat box there while we get started. So hi, everybody. My name is Madeline DeVoe. I'm the Content Marketing Manager at iWave. So welcome to our webinar today. We're very excited to have CCS Fundraising here partnered with us for this. This is Fundraising for Higher Education, Insights on Today's Philanthropic Landscape. But before I hand it over and introduce you to our wonderful presenters, I'll just go over our housekeeping items for the day. So we are everyone's in listen only mode or on mute, but please, if you have any questions or comments, you can hop into that chat box or that Q&A box. We're going to be doing some time for Q&A at the end. So pop your questions in there and I'll read them out for our presenters. You'll also be receiving this recording in a follow-up email. So stay tuned for that if you want to share it with your colleagues or rewatch it yourself. So with that, let me introduce you to our presenters today. So Julie Siebel is Vice President with CCS and in her 7th year with the firm. She has served a variety of clients in the educational, health, arts, and culture and social sectors. She currently serves in the interim management roles for Humboldt State University and the Wallace Annenberg Center for Performing Arts. She's helping these organizations build fundraising capacity, address the changes this past year has required, and prepare for upcoming significant philanthropic activity. Julie received her PhD in History and Gender Studies from the University of Southern California. And next we have Nana Opong, and Nana is Assistant Vice President with CCS and in her 5th year with the firm. She has served a variety of clients in the international, educational, health, and social sectors. She currently leads a team working on strategic operational and fundraising projects with UNCF, the United Negro College Fund. And Nana received her Master's of Public Administration degree from George Washington University in DC. So I would like to welcome Julie and Nana, and I'll hand it over to them to kick off our presentation.
Thank you, Madeline. And I would like to welcome all of you, say good morning or good afternoon, wherever this webinar finds you. On behalf of CCS Fundraising and iWave, Nana and I are excited to be able to share with you the information this morning to really help drive our thought leadership as higher ed institutions. At CCS, we partner with nonprofits for transformational change, and we want to help strengthen programs for your continued success. So hopefully the data that we're sharing today and some of the tips and ideas will engage you and be able to make your 2021 and 2022 planning stronger and more robust. If we go to the next slide, please, Maddie. We are hoping today specifically to look at not only what happened last year, we all lived through that, but look at what happened last year and use that to help shape our understanding of long-term trends going forward. How can we use those trends and that knowledge from the last year and going forward to help shape your success? We also want to leave you with a combination of both theory and practice. It's one thing to share the data, to share the details, but we also want to take a little bit deeper dive into what might work or what might help as you consider your future fundraising coming out of the year that we've all had in the past. So as we are starting to share this information, don't forget, as Madeline said, to drop your questions into the Q&A or chat box. We look forward to being able to discuss them with you at the end of the session. And with that, let's go to our next slide and look at long-term trends. What are we seeing in higher ed philanthropy today? Maddie, let's go ahead to the next slide. There you go. What we see here is that higher ed has been on an overall growth trajectory for 40 years. And this chart does show us fundraising dollars adjusted for inflation. According to both CASE and Blackbaud, in 2019, the higher ed sector saw an increase of between 6 and 8% over the year before, which is great. What I want to do is draw your attention to the 2007 to 2009 period, the last recession we had. And you'll see that dollars did drop in 2008 and 9. But what is promising is that it only took higher ed about 2 years to get back to where they were pre-recession levels, and just a few years beyond that to exceed those goals. Based on the data that we are seeing at this point in time, we are optimistic, anticipating that we'll have a similar result over the next 2 to 5 years in the higher ed sector, coming out of the economic downturn that we had in the last year. We can have the next slide. What we see here is the distribution of the major donors, the mega donors worldwide, and what they're giving to. And clearly education is the highest priority for billionaires to support, especially US billionaires. Of course, when we're looking at numbers like this, we cannot ignore the mega gifts like Michael Bloomberg's $1.8 billion in 2018 that he made to Johns Hopkins University, the Resnick's $750 million to Caltech in 2019, and Helen Diller's $500 million gift that she made as a bequest. But let's look more specifically at the high-end gifts that have been made just in 2021 alone. So to demonstrate that high-end giving has not fallen off in the course of this pandemic and global economic downturn. We have 6 gifts that have been reported in 2021 already that are at $30 million or higher. They range from $30 million to Cornell in New York and $150 million to Wofford College in South Carolina. So even as we're coming out of a global pandemic and economic downturn, we're still seeing that these billionaires are making their high-end gifts. What does that mean? We can't all count on those, but we know they're being made. We know that those priority gifts are still strong and happening. What I'd like to do though now, since we've talked about sort of the overall trends we're seeing it, is turn it over to my colleague Nana to talk a little bit about the climate survey that CCS did over the last year and what we saw happening in those trends. So Nana, it's your turn.
Thanks, Julie. And we can move to the second slide. So I will be focusing on 2 surveys. One is CASE's voluntary support of education survey, and also some surveys that CCS conducted. We may have all seen this headline, right? The Chronicle of Philanthropy, based on CASE's survey, noted that higher education was essentially flat in 2020. And the article also noted that support declined by about 0.2% to $49.5 billion, yet nearly half of responding institutions reported increases in giving. So what accounted for this discrepancy? The reason overall is due to significant gifts that impacted the aggregate results. So Julie mentioned Michael Bloomberg's gift, the $1.8 billion gift to Johns Hopkins. That was actually counted in this survey. If that gift had been excluded, you would have seen that giving to higher ed institutions in 2020 actually increased by about 3.6%. As part of that survey, VSC also looked at two-year institutions, and there we saw a 4.8% decrease in total support from 2019 to 2020. We know that most of the philanthropy to higher ed, particularly in the US, goes to four-year colleges and universities. The average support for a two-year college in the survey was about 1.9 million. And I know we have some Canadian friends in the audience. There is less comprehensive giving information for Canadian higher ed institutions. There is a study by case. It was done on fiscal year 2019. It was done in collaboration with the Canadian Council for the Advancement of Education. They surveyed about 45 colleges and universities and found that each institution secured an average of about 39.5 million in philanthropic contributions. And among the institutions who actually answered the survey for fiscal year 2018, they noticed that there was about an increase of 26% if you compared FY 2018 to FY 2019. Next slide, please. Gifts from foundations, alumni, and non-alumni together really make up about a little over one half of philanthropic giving to American higher ed institutions. You'll notice that non-alumni gifts are increasing, and actually compared to fiscal 2019, 2020 saw an increase of about 4% of gifts from non-alumni or individuals. Other organizations currently at 13%, that includes donor advice funds. We're seeing an increase of gifts from donor advice funds to higher education. CASE actually will separate this out in the 2022 report because there just seems to be a lot of gifts coming from that source. And so they want to make sure we provide additional information about that. Next slide, please. And philanthropic priorities, they've somewhat remained the same. I think one big difference is that in 2020, we saw an increase in giving in support to operations in comparison to capital expenses. The Chronicle reports that this is likely due to economic uncertainty and volatility of the stock market. And as expected, giving to financial aid remains the highest priority for most donors. When gifts are restricted to current operations, it's mostly going to research than any other category. Next slide, please. So we want to look at the impact of COVID on higher education. CCS conducted a series of surveys from spring 2020, with our last survey concluding in January 2021. And our goal was to understand how COVID-19 has affected fundraising across the nonprofit sector. We received about 1,000 responses from each of our surveys. In our January 2021 survey, we had about 143 responses from higher ed. Data across all four surveys showed that as 2020 progressed, the pandemic had less of a negative impact on fundraising. And in fact, many of the institutions saw significantly more giving throughout 2020. For respondents who reported a negative impact on fundraising, particularly due to particularly due to COVID, that decreased. So when you look in May, we had about 70% of respondents saying that COVID-19 negatively impacted fundraising. And then in January, that was down to about 45%. So a decrease of about 25 percentage points. Meanwhile, when you looked at respondents reporting an increase in fundraising, that more than quadrupled from 6% to 28% over the same time period, which was spring 2020 through January 2021. And this is quite fascinating. I mean, over the past year, our fundraising activities have evolved with this virtual environment. People are giving significantly, but they also want to see impact. And we'll talk about virtual engagement later, but we'll see that that has not had a negative impact on giving at all. So we want to talk now about where we're headed following COVID-19, and I'll turn that over to Julie.
Thanks, Nana. So we've talked about long-term trends and we've talked about what was happening last year. Let's look ahead. And when we asked our survey recipients to talk about how they felt COVID impacted their fundraising, again, about 45% told us that they saw a decrease in 2020. But what we're seeing is as people are looking ahead, they're being much more cautious. And in 21 saying, even though last year I only experienced a 45% decline, I'm expecting about 47% are expecting a decline this year. Likewise, 28% of our respondents saw an increase last year, but only 24 are willing to predict an increase next year. What we believe this is telling us is, first of all, there is not one size that's going to fit all as an answer in the COVID experience, that every institution experienced the pandemic and COVID differently. And everyone is going to need to respond to it in a slightly different way. But keeping in mind that these expectations for the year remain strong, that while there may be a continued decline, we're also seeing a commitment to either neutral or increasing growth. Most interestingly, as we move forward, let's go on to the next slide. As we move forward, we want to talk about the impact of social justice and racial equity on the world that our clients are looking at. And it certainly has been an amplified conversation for all of us this year. We are all asking ourselves what our role as leaders are in addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're also seeing how it impacts the philanthropy of our clients and looking to see if it's changing the way our clients are doing business in their philanthropic realm. In addition to workplace and donor messaging, more than a third of the climate survey respondents shared that they're working to bring greater diversity and greater representation to their boards. Likewise, 20% are revising donor cultivation processes, looking at new and different ways to bring diversity and funding to the institutions. And I want to share one story, and I have a feeling Nana might have a story to share with her client as well. But my client last summer was Humboldt State University up in Northern California. And they responded to the unanticipated needs of their students that were caused by the pandemic. More than half of their student population are students of color, and likewise, half of them are first-generation students. 75% of them qualify for financial aid. And as the pandemic was being felt far more acutely for individuals of color, those facing housing and economic insecurity, Humboldt State's Advancement Office stepped up and they adjusted their plans for their spring fundraiser. Rather than the traditional fundraising approach, they launched Humboldt Connected, which was going to be an emergency response fund to meet the needs of students that they were facing beyond the classroom. They got a preliminary $50,000 grant from a foundation, and they hoped to do a match to get to $100,000. And I'm so proud of them that they actually ended up raising $200,000 for emergency needs for their students. And when you ask how they did that, it was really three key things that they did. The first one is they reached out to all of their alumni donors during the summer just to check in and make sure they were okay, not to make an ask, just to be there. The second one is that they had solid storytelling that linked lifetime experiences with the academic ability to learn. And finally, they had an inclusive asking process that honored both high-end and smaller gifts. And it was an honor to be able to work with them as they blew their goal out of the water by looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion from a philanthropic landscape. Nana, do you have a story you want to share on diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Absolutely. I think in general, we're all seeing increased giving to minority institutions across the nonprofit sector. Prior to 2020, if you looked at giving to historically Black colleges and universities, and the Chronicle of Higher Education has a tracker of major private gifts to higher education, no historically Black college or university had been the beneficiary of any private gift of $50 million and above over the past 53 years. And that's telling. So it wasn't until 2020, with the onset of COVID and increased focus on social injustice, with our nation's reckoning with racism, that people begin to think more about HBCUs and the role they played. And it really started with the $120 million gift from Reed Hastings of Netflix and his spouse, Patty Quillen. That gift actually remains the single largest individual philanthropic investment in HBCU history. And it really serves to increase awareness and recognition of the important role that HBCUs play in ensuring Black mobility. In addition to philanthropy, we're seeing increased disbursements from the federal government. We're seeing more 7- and 8-figure gifts to HBCUs, helping to bridge that gap in sort of funding from both philanthropy and the federal government. And our hope is that this continues, because there has historically been unequal funding to these institutions who really serve so many low-income students of color and really play a significant role in educating Black leaders. Next slide, please.
Here we go. And I think what we would like to do now is pause and take a moment, Madeline, and launch our poll and ask all of you to share with us what you are doing in response to considerations around racial equity. How is that changing the way your fundraising operates?
Yeah, so we'll leave that up for a few moments. The options there are, yes, it's a major area of focus for us. Yes, it's a consideration for us, or not much of a consideration right now. See people popping their answers in there. We'll give it a few more seconds.
And while we're waiting for that to populate, I'll also say that of those top 6 gifts that I mentioned earlier for 2021 already that were above 30 million, one of them was a $40 million gift that was anonymously given to the NAACP Legal Fund to cover scholarships for lawyers for law school to help build the civil rights and equity movement, especially in the South. So it's, as Nana was talking about the growth of giving to HBCUs, we're seeing that that's ongoing with additional gifts that are coming in that are quite exciting and introducing new ways of approach.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to share the results here. You should see them on your screen in a moment.
All right. So looking at that, I'm seeing that we've got more than half of you are having the conversations, considering what it means for you and beginning to think about, I'm guessing, the changes that you need to make in your board membership, your staffing, your cultivation processes. Congratulations to the third of you who are actually already making it a major area of focus. And we'll challenge those who aren't considering it yet to just find the bandwidth. I know we are all so stretched for time and effort and emotional integrity these days, but we encourage you to find the bandwidth. Nana, did you have any observations on those polls to add?
No, I think, everyone's having that conversation, not just in the nonprofit sector, but in every single sector. And that's where we start, right? The conversation, and hopefully the conversation actually leads to more impactful change.
Thank you. All right, so let's close the poll and go on to the next slide. What does all of this mean for fundraising and your expectations for the year ahead? What our respondents to the survey said are a little bit different for different fundraising programs, but in the higher ed sector, we see that it shouldn't be a surprise to us that major gifts remain the #1 source of funding, and almost half, 44%, said they expect to see an increase in major gift fundraising over the year ahead, which is very rewarding. It shows a good, strong connectivity, relationship building, making the case with those donors who have the capacity to give a 5-figure gift or larger in a unique one-standing environment. Not surprising, we see a 72% decrease in events. And this is not surprising, but it's also a bit of a challenge in the higher ed environment. When you think about it, events are not your life source for fundraising, but they are for your fundraising. Your alumni weekend, your parents' weekend, your back to campus opportunities. And the chance to find new ways to build those relationships will truly be the challenge, I think, for the next 3 to 5 years as we figure out how to close the gap between having a year, 2 years, even 3 years where we haven't been able to have as much in-person event. How are we going to keep building those relationships that are going to lead to your major gift strategy? Interestingly, when we talk to all of our donors and all of our participants about capital campaigns, we found that combined 80% of the people who responded are either in a campaign, starting one, or getting ready to start one. What that means is 1 in 5 said they intend to kick off a new capital campaign in 2021, and an additional 17% are considering starting one. So while there is this lingering concern and maybe a lack of overall confidence on how much money is going to be raised, there is still that aspirational vision for the future. And if we haven't learned anything else over this past year, it's to look to the future and find ways to fulfill the promise of so many people that have suffered over the past year, year and a half. So now we'd like to turn from theory to practice. And Nana, I want to turn it over to you for some tips for success.
Absolutely, the dreaded virtual engagement. I recall at the beginning of COVID how challenging it was to convince clients to just get online and talk to donors or pick up the phone and talk to donors. With my client, we just did just call your donor and check in. This isn't the time to ask for a gift. We just want to check in. And now sort of this virtual engagement has become part of our lifestyle. So as we continue to work offsite, virtual engagement with donors will continue and it will likely evolve. In our CCS January survey, 74% of higher ed respondents said they had conducted a virtual major gift request in the past year. And 61% of those respondents said the gift request meetings were either as successful or more successful than in person. I have heard a lot of anecdotes from clients who say that people just want to talk. People are looking forward to that phone call or that Zoom call. They're looking for that personal interaction. So a lot of these gift request meetings have been quite successful. Next slide, please. And as I said, I think this might be as everyone is saying, our new normal. It may be here to stay. Even when we are in person, there will continue to be some sort of virtual donor engagement. And actually, Julie, I was a bit surprised to see that there will be a decrease in events, because I think even in terms of events, people are looking forward to participate virtually. 48% of respondents to this survey said that their events will be modified to include both a hybrid and a virtual in-person option. I have seen that actually start a lot with, for example, golf tournaments are happening where I live in Maryland. And also, you know, solicitations are going to evolve and be modified to include both in-person and virtual solicitations.
Just suppose, Nana, that part of it is how we define the word event. We now need to look at virtual events as events themselves, or those blended events as the same thing as getting everybody back together or having the black tie dinner. It's rethinking the linguistics of the conversation.
So now we just want to take a moment and see how your advancement teams are addressing planning. We have another poll. Do you intend to offer virtual event and or major gift solicitation options after social distancing requirements are no longer in place?
Lots of answers coming in. We'll give it a few more seconds. Okay. You should see the results on your screen.
And we have 71% saying yes, both virtual and in person. And I think that that's what we're going to see a lot of across the sector. Even as, you know, vaccinations are going out, there's still going to be a little bit of hesitancy in getting together. And so making sure that we're offering both options is extremely important. Okay. Thank you. Julie?
Yeah, so as we come to summarize everything we've talked about today, we wanted to leave you with these 5 overall tips for navigating today's landscape. And truly they are the fundamentals of what we all know. These shouldn't be a surprise to you, but make sure that you take a look at your messaging. Is it impactful and urgent? Is it compelling? Have you refreshed it based on the experiences of the campus over the last year? What images might need to be changed? What stories could be updated? How can you wrap into your messaging a future forward approach so that, yes, we had 2020. What are some success stories from 2020? What are they doing to influence going forward? How are your faculty employing a virtual blended environment? How did your students potentially thrive in an environment that should have been incredibly challenging and certainly was for many? But there are probably some really interesting success stories in there. Then we want to go to creative cultivating. And this truly is looking at how do we find virtual events that can be a cultivation source that we might never have considered before? How can those one-on-one conversations over Zoom be helpful? Are there volunteers who can step up and broaden your approach and help with your cultivation? Are there events that you can hold in person, even with the vaccination rates rising, that will be as inclusive as possible and help people feel comfortable re-engaging with the university? When we were at the height of the pandemic this last year, as Nana said, we had a lot of challenge trying to convince our clients that it was really okay to keep asking. But there is never a reason to stop. You are building relationships with these individuals, and they will let you know if you've built the right pipeline and you've built the right relationship, if the time is right for an ask. And we've seen that for those organizations, those universities that have continued to maintain their prospect pipeline, their cultivation strategies, and worked the system well, the donors are continuing to give. They want to support their alma mater, and they want to be shown why it's important to continue supporting their alma mater. Moving on beyond that, we both want to, and CCS wants to challenge everyone to think about how the conversation around social justice and DEI efforts can enhance your fundraising. They're difficult conversations, but think about what might need to change in your cultivation process to make it more inclusive. What could you do to incorporate a different set of voices at the table for your board meetings, for your community outreach, for your town and gown activities, for your committees? What sort of conversations do you need to have about fundraising? And are the funds you are asking for meeting the needs of today's and tomorrow's students, not only for their classroom experience, but their life beyond the classroom, so that they are not being challenged by housing and food insecurities while they're also trying to get a degree? And finally, we want to offer to you the thought that higher education is always a thought leader, always providing resources in a variety of different arenas. So why not in the social justice and DEI arena, as we are working to integrate that into our philanthropy? Why not lead by example and find ways to drive the conversation and be a thought leader for how to integrate and amplify those voices that we haven't heard before and truly address inequities? Nana, is there anything you want to add to those tips?
So I'm looking at the first and the last. I think everybody needs to sort of go back and review their case. This is a time to rethink, revise, and actually a good opportunity to get donors to react to a case and therefore get their before a gift request. And then in terms of positioning higher ed as a leader in research, we're all looking for experts on different subject matters, and why not the higher ed community, right? Positioning some of the experts there on various issues. With my client, we have held since COVID-19, 2 briefings with just corporate and business leaders on various topics. We talked about reopening schools and what that means for students. And so people are looking for opportunities to learn and to hear from experts, and higher ed really can serve as that vehicle for that.
Those are great additions. Madeline, what we would like to do is go to our next slide and answer any questions. Take a few minutes now to respond to comments that we've had in the box.
Yeah, of course. It's been kind of a quiet group. I've seen a couple of questions come in, but I do encourage you to pop your questions into the question box or the chat, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So the first one that came up here is, my board is skeptical that now is an appropriate time for a major gift fundraising initiative with everything going on in the world today. What can I tell them?
I'm laughing. Nana, I don't know about you, I'm hearing that all the time. Conservative members of boards saying maybe we shouldn't, fiscally conservative, maybe this isn't the right thing. I would say, and then Nana, I'll let you answer as well, I would say that part of it is education, is helping your board see that what they may personally be feeling is not necessarily what the trends are that we're seeing nationwide. That many times we forget that our board members are people first and board members second, and give them the statistics, give them the trends, help them understand that while they personally may not be feeling confident, that this is truly the time to step forward and be as confident, be as aspirational as possible.
Yes, and I think sometimes there is hesitation because it's been tried and maybe it failed. And so what I always say to my client is, well, let's just pilot it with a few people. Let's not do a whole big initiative. Let's do something small. And if that is successful, then we can move forward with it. And I think people are often more open to doing that initially.
Thank you. Many of these questions are sort of about like getting your board on board and governance and stuff like that. But another question is, do you have any recommendations for specific resources for diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially for governance and development to be considering when making a plan for the organization?
Nana, you want to take that one first?
I'm trying to think. Resources. So if you're in this area in terms of the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, there is a group called the Center for Nonprofit Advancement that has a lot of resources on how to build DEI initiatives within your organization. I think I'd have to think a little more about national resources. I would think maybe the independent sector, for example, might have some stuff out there also.
I know as well that CASE has been doing a significant amount of work around diversity, equity, and inclusion for the last 2 or 3 years. So they've been working on integrating it into all of their programming. So CASE is going to have some resources. And then we can't overlook the Lilly School of Philanthropy at Indiana. While their Women's Philanthropy Institute is primarily gender-based, they have done a deep dive into diversity, equity, and inclusion. They've looked at giving trends of families of color. They've looked at it across age groups. Lots of resources out there, and they're climbing by the month.
Yeah, exactly. Great, thank you. We have a quiet group today. So if there's no other questions, I'll put a last call for questions in there. But you can still pop your questions in while we finish up here, and we can reach out to you afterwards. So I'll hand it back to you folks.
Thanks, Madeline. And we would like to thank all of you for joining us. We have gone through a lot of statistical information today, but all of it has been really high level. And we encourage you to go onto our website and download our education higher ed spotlight report, which will give you everything we've talked about and more in detail. So looping back around to that question about how do you help your board understand the importance, there's information in here that will be fantastic for you to be able to give to your board. And in fact, you might want to download and share either the full report or sections of the report with your board. And when you're on our website, there are also other reports, the full survey and our philanthropic landscape. So we encourage you to go in there and download those. And then the last slide in the deck, we have both of our email addresses. So it has been a quiet group today, but if something comes up to you, you think of a question after we've wrapped up today, please don't hesitate to shoot an email to either one of us. We would be happy to respond to you offline. It's always a pleasure talking to individuals in the higher ed sector. We both enjoy doing that. So with that, I would like to thank iWave, and on behalf of CCS Fundraising, Nana and I are pleased that you were able to join us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Like I said, we will be sharing this recording in a follow-up email, and I'll also share the link to download that report. So yeah, let us know if we have any questions. I'll leave this screen up so you can write down this contact info, and thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.